So imagine stepping into, like, the most majestic cathedral in the world.
Okay, yeah, I can picture it.
You're looking at the soaring arches, the stained glass, the centuries of accumulated reverence.
Right, the weight of history.
Exactly. Because when we look at the history of a massive, globally recognized institution, there's this expectation of clarity. You expect an architectural blueprint.
Yeah, like a public record of what they're all about.
Right. The foundation was laid in this year, the walls were built by these people, and the stated purpose of the building is written right there above the door.
And as a historian, or, just a curious observer, you point to that blueprint and say, well, that makes sense. That's how human history is built.
It's how we organize our understanding of reality. I mean, we rely on those stated goals.
We do. We rely on the public records, the theological text that an institution presents to the world. We fundamentally want to believe that the outward-facing identity of a global power is, at its core, genuine.
Right. But today, you have handed us a stack of sources that takes that architectural blueprint, sets it completely on fire, and reveals a subterranean labyrinth underneath it that is, well, it's almost too dark to comprehend.
It really is. We are stepping into an investigative landscape of shadow geopolitics and esoteric theology, where absolutely nothing is what it seems.
So, welcome to the deep dive. The texts we are unpacking today read like an apocalyptic espionage thriller.
They really do.
And we need to establish the rules of engagement right at the top here. The central thesis woven through all these documents, from the whistleblower testimonies to the historical analyses, is just staggering.
A massive paradigm shift.
They argue that a massive interconnected network, so we're talking the Vatican, the Pope, the Holy See, the Jesuits, the Masons, the Knights of Malta, the bishops, and the Roman Catholic Church, that they are not acting as Christian institutions.
Not even slightly. The authors of these texts, they strip away the Christian facade entirely.
The sources claim that they are an ancient coordinated cabal, a Babylonian Luciferian superpower. Yeah.
And their primary historical and ongoing target, the systematic exploitation, trafficking, and control of the most vulnerable among us.
The children.
Right. The refrain that echoes through all these documents is chillingly specific. They are not Christians, and they came for the children.
And that brings us to the crucial disclaimer for today's deep dive, because we need to be clear with you listening.
Very clear.
We are looking at highly charged, highly controversial, and undeniably horrifying claims made by the authors of these texts. We are not taking sides.
Right. We are not endorsing these viewpoints as absolute truth, nor are we attempting to debunk or defend the institutions mentioned.
Exactly. Our job today is strictly to impartially report on the narrative architecture these authors have built. We are decoding their arguments, explaining their underlying logic, and connecting the dots exactly as the original material presents them.
So, for the duration of this conversation, we are stepping inside their paradigm. When we discuss a claim, we are exploring the reality constructed by the source texts. We aren't going to constantly interrupt ourselves by saying, the author claims, every single sentence.
Right, that would get exhausting. We are walking through their blueprint. And looking at the foundation of this blueprint, the authors are adamant that we have to completely reframe how we view the Roman Catholic Church.
Because if you look at public data, it's the largest Christian denomination in the world.
Yeah, over 1 billion people.
But these texts, leaning heavily on writers like Avro Manhattan, argue that viewing it merely as a religion is a fatal analytical flaw. They argue it is a political and intelligent superpower that rivals the United States or the Soviet Union.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And the mechanism of that power is what the sources find so fascinating. Because if you are the United States, your power is largely defined by your borders, your military, and your economic output.
Right, physical things.
Exactly. But Manhattan and the other authors argue that the Vatican's power is decentralized. It's embedded within the borders of every other sovereign nation.
For those billion adherents.
Yes. In the view of these texts, that isn't just a flock of believers. It is a globally distributed network of potential intelligence assets, political lobbyists, and ideological foot soldiers who answer to a centralized command structure in Rome.
And the sources argue that the command structure itself isn't even Christian.
Right.
They claim it's a Babylonian Luciferian religion based on sun worship, which, I mean, when I first read that, it sounded like a massive leap.
Oh, totally. It sounds absurd on its face.
But the texts actually break down the mechanics of how they trace this. They don't just say, oh, they're Babylonian. They point to the physical and ritualistic architecture.
The obelisks.
Yes. They point to the obelisks in the center of St. Peter's Square, which are literal ancient Egyptian monuments dedicated to the sun god.
Brought over from Egypt.
Right. And they point to the monstrance, the golden vessel used to display the Eucharist, which is shaped exactly like a radiating sunburst. The authors argue that the public thinks they are participating in a Christian communion, but the inner circle is executing an ancient, esoteric sun worship ritual hiding in plain sight.
It's this concept of a dual doctrine.
What do you mean?
So the esoteric hidden meaning is reserved for the elite initiates, while the exoteric public-facing rituals, they just pacify the masses.
Wow.
And to manage this dual reality on a global scale, you need an enforcement mechanism. You need a specialized, highly disciplined intelligence wing. And the texts identify the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, as the absolute apex of this apparatus.
See, usually when you hear Jesuit, you think of universities, observatories, intellectual pursuits.
Right, high schools.
Exactly. But the texts frame their founding by Ignatius of Loyola in the 1540s as the creation of a military intelligence agency designed specifically to protect and expand papal power.
And the defining mechanism of the Jesuits, according to the sources, is the absolute annihilation of the individual ego.
Yeah, that quote from Loyola was intense.
They quote his own writings to prove the psychological conditioning required. He wrote, "I will believe that the white that I see is black, if the hierarchical church so defines it."
That's just wild.
It is the crucial quote for understanding the author's thesis. Because in intelligence work, an operative who can be persuaded by logic or personal morality is a liability.
Right, you want them to just follow orders.
Exactly. By establishing a culture where objective reality, seeing white as white, must be instantly discarded if the institution dictates it as black, the Jesuits created the perfect, incorruptible operational tool.
So they don't even trust their own eyes.
Nope. And the sources argue the supreme, terrifying discipline is what allowed the Jesuit leadership, commanded by the Black Pope, to operate invisibly behind the scenes of global history.
The Black Pope being the superior general of the Jesuits.
Right. And the texts allege they utilized this disciplined network to infiltrate Freemasonry, manipulate European monarchs, and engineer the geopolitical tensions that led to World War I, World War II, and the Cold War.
Okay, so if the Jesuits are the invisible intelligence arm, the texts point to the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Knights of Malta, as the diplomatic and military logistical wing.
Yes, and their legal status is the puzzle piece that explains how this entire cabal operates.
Right, because the sources emphasize that the Knights of Malta are an independent, sovereign nation recognized by international law.
But they have no physical country.
Exactly. It's so weird.
It is a brilliant tactical advantage, according to the texts. They have a headquarters building in Rome, but they possess all the legal rights of a nation-state.
So what does that actually let them do?
Well, they issue their own passports, which are recognized by over 100 countries. They have diplomatic immunity. They utilize diplomatic pouches, which under international law cannot be searched or seized by customs agents at any border.
That is the ultimate logistical dream for an illicit network. I mean, you can move funds, classified documents, or even human beings across international borders, and local law enforcement legally cannot look inside the trunk of the car or the diplomatic bag.
Precisely. The authors argue this sovereign status creates an impenetrable cutout.
A cutout?
Yeah, a cutout, in espionage terms, is a mechanism that separates the leadership from the operation, providing plausible deniability. The texts claim the Knights of Malta act as this cutout, deeply intertwining the Vatican with the CIA, the Pentagon, and what the sources call the European black nobility.
The black nobility being the ancient aristocratic bloodlines of Europe that trace their lineage back to the Roman Empire, holding the actual invisible wealth of the continent.
Right. Old money.
Really old money. The texts claim that these elite families, high-ranking military officials, and intelligence directors all overlap within the Knights of Malta. It's the nexus point.
And it isn't just a Catholic operation, which is interesting.
Yeah, the texts bring in the Order of St. John in the UK, arguing that this Protestant equivalent serves the exact same masters. The religious divide is an illusion for the public. At the top, the power structure is unified.
And this brings us to the Freemasons. Because officially, the Catholic Church has Canon 2335.
Right, which explicitly forbids a Catholic from joining the Freemasons under penalty of excommunication.
Exactly. But the authors of our sources argue that this public ban is a calculated farce designed to keep the lower-level believers segregated while the elites mingle freely.
They point to the P2 Lodge in Italy as the smoking gun for this.
Oh, propaganda dude, yeah.
Yeah, this was a secret Masonic lodge uncovered in the 1980s, and the membership list was a who's who of Italian intelligence, military generals, and crucially, top-tier Vatican bankers and bishops.
The public ban meant nothing.
Nothing at all. It's like Russian nesting dolls of power.
Yeah.
Christianity is the outermost public-facing doll. You open it up, and inside is the intelligence apparatus of the Jesuits and the Knights of Malta. You open that up and you find elite secret societies like the P2 Lodge. And at the very core, the sources claim, is a Luciferian cult.
It's layers upon layers.
But here's the synthesis we need to make here. If they aren't actually Christian, what is the ideological glue holding this multinational labyrinth together? Like, what are they building?
Well, the sources refer to their ideology as the devil's simulation. The ultimate goal is pure, unadulterated, centralized power, culminating in a new world order or a blessed despotism.
Blessed despotism. What a terrifying oxymoron.
Right. The texts argue that the cabal's objective is to return global society to the absolute, unquestioned control of the Dark Ages. They want a world where a Roman priest king rules over an exhausted, subservient population.
So the religion is just a tool.
Exactly. The religious trappings, the charity work, the cathedrals, these are merely the most effective psychological and PR tools ever invented to maintain compliance while they extract wealth and engineer human history.
Which brings us to the darkest realization of this blueprint. If this cabal exists to maintain absolute dominance over the human race, how do they exercise that control on a visceral human level?
Right.
How do they ensure their machinery keeps turning? The sources provide a harrowing answer. They argue that the ultimate expression of this power is the systematic targeting, separation, and destruction of children.
The thesis is explicit. They are not Christians, and they came for the children.
Right.
The authors argue that exploiting children is not a modern aberration or, an administrative failure of the modern church. They view it as a foundational, centuries-old operational standard.
It's built into the system.
And they trace a terrifying historical precedent where the institution utilized highly specialized theological loopholes to justify tearing families apart.
Let's look at the mechanics of how they actually did this, starting with the Mortora case in the 1850s, because it perfectly illustrates how theological doctrine was weaponized as a legal kidnapping tool.
Yeah, the Edgardo Mortarda case is brutal.
So Edgardo Mortora was a Jewish infant living in the Papal States in Italy. He fell severely ill. His family had a teenage Catholic servant girl working in the house.
And she gets worried.
Right. The servant is terrified that the baby would die without baptism and burn in hell, so she secretly sprinkles water on him and performs a makeshift baptism.
Which she told no one about at the time.
Yeah, and the child recovered. But years later, word of this secret baptism leaked to the Inquisitional authorities. And here is where the legal mechanism of the Papal States kicked in.
Under papal law, the moment that water touched his head, Edgardo ceased to be Jewish.
Legally and spiritually, he was property of the Catholic Church.
And the law dictated that a Catholic child could not be raised by infidels, even if those infidels were his biological parents.
So the papal police marched into the Mortara home, physically ripped a crying 6-year-old boy out of his parents' arms, and took him to Rome.
Pope Pius IX personally intervened, effectively adopting the boy and placing him in a specialized institution designed to convert Jews.
And the blowback was immense, right? The sources detail how international press, foreign governments, and even the Rothschild banking family wrote personal appeals to the Vatican demanding the child be returned.
But the authors focus on the Vatican's response, specifically the PR spin utilized by the Jesuit-run publication, La Civiltà Cattolica.
They didn't apologize.
Not at all. They argued that the boy was miraculously begging to remain in his Christian home. They actively deployed vicious anti-Semitic tropes, suggesting the Jewish parents only wanted the boy back so they could torture or kill him for becoming Catholic.
It's the ultimate gaslighting. And the sources point out that this wasn't an isolated incident. It established a working precedent. The theological concept of saving souls became a skeleton key to bypass human rights.
Once a child is baptized, they belong to the system.
Right, and the texts show this exact same legalistic land grab happening on a massive scale a century later in the aftermath of the Holocaust.
Yeah, during World War II, desperate Jewish parents facing deportation to death camps handed their children over to Catholic convents, orphanages, or families to hide them.
Just to keep them alive.
Exactly. And to ensure these children blended in and survived, many were baptized. But in 1946, when the war was over and surviving relatives or Jewish organizations came looking for these orphans, the sources cite a specific, chilling directive from Pope Pius XII.
The Pope allegedly issued an explicit order that any Jewish child who had received a Catholic baptism during the war should not be returned to their surviving families.
The text note that figures like former Chief Rabbi Yisrael Mirlau actively petitioned Pope Pius XII just to discuss a mechanism for locating these orphans, and the Pope flatly refused.
The authors frame this as a massive, opportunistic acquisition of human capital. It wasn't about returning children to their traumatized communities. It was about expanding the flock.
The theological justification that the baptism could not be undone was the shield used to absorb an entire generation of traumatized children into the institution.
And the logistical networks required to move and absorb these children were already well established. The sources point to the Home Children Operation, which began way back in 1618.
This is a huge piece of the puzzle.
It involved rounding up vagrant, impoverished, or simply unwanted children in the UK and shipping them across the ocean to colonies like Canada and Australia.
And this is where the overlapping networks become crucial. Because the UK was a Protestant nation. The sources argue that this forced migration, which was effectively a state-sanctioned child slave labor program, was initially managed by Protestant fronts, specifically Freemasonry.
But the authors argue that the global Catholic infrastructure saw the utility in this human pipeline and integrated with it.
The documents explicitly highlight the Knights of Malta exploring juvenile immigration to Australia in the 1940s. They cite a brother Conlon, who traveled to Malta to orchestrate shipments of children.
Think about the sheer logistics of moving thousands of unaccompanied minors across the globe. You need ships, forged or manipulated travel documents, receiving facilities, and a complete lack of governmental oversight.
And the sources argue that only a sovereign entity like the Knights of Malta, working in tandem with infiltrated secret societies, could facilitate that level of human trafficking under the guise of charity.
And we see this terrifying collusion between state power and church logistics peak in the mid to late 20th century, specifically in fascist regimes like Franco's Spain and during Argentina's Dirty War.
In both instances, the authors detail how the government and the church worked hand in glove to steal babies from political dissidents.
In Spain, the mechanics were brutal. Nuns and priests allegedly acted as the brokers. When a political dissident or an impoverished mother gave birth in a Catholic hospital, they were told the baby was stillborn.
Meanwhile, the child was smuggled out the back door and sold to a good, loyal Catholic family.
The church provided the moral authority to convince the biological mother her child was dead, and the logistical network to launder the child into a new life.
And in Argentina, the allegations in the sources point directly at the top of the modern church hierarchy. Pope Francis, Jorge Bergoglio. During the military junta's reign of terror, pregnant dissidents were routinely kidnapped, held until they gave birth, and then executed by being thrown out of airplanes over the ocean. Their babies were given to military families. The text claimed that during his time as the Jesuit provincial general in Argentina, Bergoglio was directly approached by the Della Quadra family.
The family knew their daughter was pregnant and in military custody. They begged Bergoglio for help.
And the sources allege that Bergoglio intentionally stalled, eventually passing the inquiry to a subordinate bishop.
And that bishop allegedly returned with a report confirming the junta had kept the young woman alive just long enough to deliver her baby before murdering her and giving the child to an important family.
The authors accuse Bergoglio of failing to use his immense influence to intervene, effectively making the Jesuit leadership complicit in the junta's baby-stealing apparatus.
When you look at this entire historical timeline, from the Mortaras to the Holocaust orphans to the home children to the fascist baby brokering, the texts reveal a refined technology of human extraction.
The theological concept of saving souls was the perfect, unassailable public relations cover.
Right. It allowed them to build orphanages, adoption agencies, and international diplomatic pipelines, the entire infrastructure of trafficking, all while wearing the mask of holy charity.
So they built this massive global infrastructure for capturing and controlling children over centuries.
But as society modernized, as human rights became a global standard and investigative journalism took off, how did this system survive?
According to the text, it didn't dismantle itself. It simply went underground, evolving into a highly protected systemic fortress. Which brings us to the modern era of the abuse network and the architecture of the cover-up.
The sources are unrelenting on this point. When we look at the modern Catholic child sexual abuse scandal, the authors argue vehemently that this is not a collection of isolated tragedies committed by a few rogue priests.
They define it as a coordinated, protected, and fully aware underground network. The exploitation wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature.
And to explain the mechanics of this cover-up, the texts rely on deep insiders. Father Tom Doyle, a former Vatican lawyer, is a primary voice here. He outlines what he calls an unwritten policy to lie.
And he breaks down exactly how the geographic shuffling of priests functioned as a legal evasion tactic.
Right, because when a bishop discovered a priest was abusing children, the systemic response was never to involve secular law enforcement.
Instead, they would quietly transfer the priest to a new parish, a new state, or a new country.
Father Doyle points out that this wasn't just about hiding the problem. It was a calculated exploitation of jurisdictional boundaries.
By moving a predator across borders, they complicated police investigations, ran out the clock on local statutes of limitations, and as Doyle grimly notes, actively created a whole new crop of victims to protect the institution's public standing.
The texts don't just rely on individual whistleblowers. They bring in international legal bodies. They deeply analyze the 2014 report by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child.
The UN explicitly accused the Holy See of protecting perpetrators and prioritizing institutional reputation over the lives of children.
But the authors of our sources go further. They explain the specific diplomatic weapon the Vatican used to block these investigations, the Concordat.
We mentioned earlier that the Vatican operates as a sovereign superpower. A concordat is a formal, legally binding treaty negotiated between the Holy See and a nation-state. It dictates the relationship between the Church and the local government.
The authors, aligning with the UN's findings, argue that the Vatican weaponized these concordats to grant their personnel functional immunity.
Let's explain how that works on the ground. Say a local police chief in a town in Europe gets a credible report of abuse at a local parish.
Normally, they get a warrant, kick the door down, and seize the files.
But because of a concordat, the Church can claim that parish files are the internal documents of a sovereign foreign state. The police chief hits a diplomatic brick wall.
The texts argue the Vatican essentially negotiated legal force fields around their abusers, neutralizing local law enforcement before an investigation could even begin.
And this legal force field was strongest around the most elite, well-funded orders. The sources heavily scrutinized groups like Opus Dei and the Legion of Christ.
They point to Father Marshall Massell, the founder of the Legion of Christ, as the ultimate proof of systemic complicity.
Maciel is a horrific figure. The sources detail how he was a prolific, known abuser of seminarians and children for decades.
Yet, he traveled the world, built a massive empire, and enjoyed the absolute untouchable protection of the Vatican's inner circle. How did he buy that protection?
Literally with money. The texts argue that Maciel was an incredible fundraiser, funneling massive amounts of wealth into Rome.
In exchange, the authors claim he was granted total impunity by Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict VI.
His crimes were an open secret among the Vatican elite, yet they shielded him completely. The authors note that it wasn't until his dying days, when the public pressure became insurmountable, that Benedict VI ordered him to a life of prayer and penance.
Which is a theological slap on the wrist. They purposely kept him out of a secular criminal court to protect the cabal's secrets.
And the sources detail how this systemic protection resulted in localized reigns of terror. They describe the Irish Magdalene Laundries, where women and children were subjected to state-sanctioned slave labor.
They point to the schools for the deaf in Ireland, specifically highlighting Father Neil Gallinaw. The texts claim he ran a literal reign of sexual terror over vulnerable deaf children in the 1970s.
A vulnerability is key there.
Yeah.
They specifically targeted deaf children who literally could not speak out, ensuring silence.
And the sources point to the Regensburg choir boys in Germany. This famous elite choir was directed by Father Georg Ratzinger, the elder brother of Pope Benedict VI, for 30 years.
The authors claim that under his watch, boys were subjected to severe physical abuse, canings, and what victims explicitly described as ritual abuse.
And when the public finally demanded answers, the texts expose the mechanics of the sham investigations. They note that the initial diocese investigations in Regensburg were fatally flawed because the investigators flat out refused to interview the former students.
You don't fail to interview the victims by accident. You do it when your goal is to orchestrate a cover-up, masquerading as an inquiry.
But this raises the most difficult logistical question of the entire deep dive. In an era of the internet, 247 global media, and independent police forces, how does a conspiracy involving thousands of perpetrators and victims not collapse? How do you maintain the cover-up on a global scale?
The authors argue that the cabal doesn't just play defense. They play offense through active, systemic infiltration. They call it Vatican deniability.
The texts claim that the cabal utilizes its overlapping networks, the Knights of Malta, the Freemasons, the secret societies, to place fiercely loyal agents into the very secular institutions designed to investigate them.
The sources specifically allege the infiltration of police forces, pointing to the Irish Gardaí as a prime example of why the cover-ups in Ireland were so absolute.
Right. If the police sergeant receiving the abuse complaint is a member of a Catholic secret society or a Masonic lodge tied to the cabal, the file simply disappears into a shredder. The investigation is botched from day one.
The texts even claim they place operatives in key media positions to spike stories and control the narrative, and utilize Knights of Malta in the judiciary to ensure judges rule in favor of the church's diplomatic immunity.
This system doesn't collapse because the people tasked with dismantling the system are secretly serving it.
But as we dive deeper into the text, the authors propose a terrifying reality. They argue that this massive global legal force field, the infiltration of police and courts, the geopolitical maneuvering, you don't build a vault of that magnitude just to hide public relations nightmares or shield pedophiles from prison.
Right. You build a vault that thick because of what is happening at the very core of the labyrinth. And this is where we have to take a deep breath. Because the authors now transition from institutional cover-ups into the absolute darkest claims presented in the entire stack of documents.
Lucifer's Lodge and the mechanics of satanic ritual abuse.
Yeah.
The sources allege that a faction operating within the highest, most elite echelons of the church hierarchy actively practices satanic ritual abuse, SRA, and child sacrifice.
They argue that the pedophilia documented in the public scandals isn't merely a crime of opportunity by broken men, it is a fundamental required religious rite for the initiates of this hidden cabal.
To make this staggering claim, the texts rely on the testimonies of people who claim to have been inside the room. They start with Father Malachi Martin.
Martin was not a fringe outsider. He was a deeply connected Jesuit priest, an intelligence asset who operated inside the Vatican before becoming a vocal, controversial author. What exactly did he expose?
Martin claimed that a satanic network, which he explicitly named Lucifer's Lodge, or the Superforce, existed among the highest-ranking bishops and cardinals in Rome.
He claimed they had mother chapels operating covertly, subverting the physical architecture of the church for dark rites.
And the sources emphasized that Martin didn't view this as a theoretical theology. He believed it was a violent, lethal mafia.
And he had a deeply personal reason to believe that. The texts detailed the murder of his close friend, Father Alfred Kunz.
Kunz was an Orthodox Catholic priest operating in Wisconsin, and according to Martin, he was actively investigating this homosexual satanic network within the clergy. In 1998, Kunz was found murdered inside his own church.
The physical mechanics of the murder are what the sources focus on. Kunz's throat was slit. The texts draw a highly specific, chilling parallel to occult practices, noting that exactly 24 hours prior, a calf was found sacrificed on a nearby farm.
Its throat was slit in the exact same manner, and its genitals were removed.
The authors argue this was not a random robbery. It was a ritualistic assassination. By mirroring the calf sacrifice, the cabal was sending a message.
In their dark theology, they were marking Kunz as an animal, unfit for spiritual redemption, and simultaneously silencing his investigation into the Superforce.
But Malachi Martin's insider warnings are just the prelude to the most harrowing testimony in the documents, the account of a woman named Svali.
Svali's testimony is incredibly granular, which is why the authors feature it so prominently. She claims she was not recruited, but born into the Illuminati, a generational victim of the cabal.
And she details the exact mechanics of her initiation ceremony, which she says she was forced to endure at the age of 12.
She claims she was flown to Rome and taken deep into the catacombs beneath the Vatican.
She describes the architecture of the space perfectly aligning with occult geometry, a secret, circular room with exactly 13 distinct passageways leading outwards.
She claims that blocking each of these 13 passageways was a mummified body.
In the center of this room was a massive table made of dark glass or obsidian. Svali claims she watched as a drugged toddler was carried into the room and placed on the obsidian stone.
A priest dressed in scarlet robes approached the table, flanked by two figures she identified as a French father and a German father of the Illuminati.
And she testifies that she watched the priest sacrifice the child on the altar. Following the murder, the traumatized 12-year-old Svali was forced to swear an unbreakable blood oath of allegiance to the New World Order.
The authors corroborate her horrifying account by referencing another alleged whistleblower, a woman named Maria, who reportedly tried to expose similar catacomb rituals before mysteriously jumping to her death from the Vatican roof in the 1980s.
The sources then expand this localized horror into a global network, introducing the Ninth Circle cult.
This is cited via a tribunal led by a controversial figure named Kevin Annett. The texts explain that the Ninth Circle is a reference to Dante's Inferno.
In Dante's vision of hell, the lowest, darkest, most frozen circle is not for murderers or thieves. It is reserved exclusively for those who commit the ultimate betrayal of a sacred trust.
And the authors ask, what trust is more sacred than humanity's inherent duty to protect a child?
The texts allege that the Ninth Circle is the absolute apex of the cabal, involving high-ranking cardinals, European royalty, and global elites.
They claim this group routinely sacrifices children and animals, utilizing the blood of the innocent as a literal spiritual tool to manifest earthly power.
And they argue this network spans the globe, utilizing the Knights of Malta's diplomatic immunity and international ship channels to traffic victims from Europe to places as far as Australia.
Which seamlessly connects to the testimony of Katie Groves, expanding the geographical footprint of the cult. Groves claims to be a survivor of what she calls Uncle Sam's snuff factory.
According to the text, she details a CIA-run underground facility located in central Texas.
Her testimony explicitly intertwines the highest levels of United States government intelligence with ancient occult ritualistic abuse, claiming the facility catered specifically to wealthy global elites and aristocrats who wanted to participate in these rites.
Reading through these accounts, Svali's obsidian tables beneath the Vatican, Malachi Martin's Lucifer's Lodge, the CIA running snuff factories in Texas, it is completely overwhelming. It sounds like a script for a dark fantasy horror movie.
It really does.
And I have to push back here, trying to understand the logic of the authors. If we look strictly at the internal framework these sources have built, what is the actual purpose of elites engaging in something so cartoonishly evil?
Right.
If you are a billionaire, a cardinal, or a CIA director, you already have mansions, yachts, and immense political power. Why descend into a catacomb to murder a child?
That is the essential question to understanding the blueprint. Why risk exposure for this? The authors explain that the motivation is twofold. First, there's a profound dark theology driving them, which the sources call the Luciferian doctrine.
In this esoteric belief system, a child is not merely a human being. The child is a living proxy for Christ.
The pure innocence of a toddler represents the divine purity of God on earth.
So, to the cabal, the physical destruction of the child is a spiritual act of war.
Exactly. The authors argue that the rape, torture, and eventual murder of the child is viewed by the initiates as the culmination of the fallen archangel's rites. It is a symbolic, ritualistic destruction of God's presence, an ultimate act of rebellion that they believe grants them spiritual supremacy.
But beyond the theology, the authors point to a deeply pragmatic, worldly mechanism at play, and that mechanism is blackmail.
Mutual assured destruction.
Yes. Think about how you control powerful people. If you require your highest-ranking members, your bankers, your generals, your politicians, to participate in the most heinous, unforgivable crime imaginable, and you document it, you have instantly secured their absolute, unbreakable loyalty.
Because if a politician ever decides to step out of line, or a banker grows a conscience and wants to leave the cabal, you don't just fire them.
You release the tape of what they did in the catacombs, and their life is instantly destroyed. It's the ultimate structural mortar.
The ritualistic abuse is the spiritual engine, but the blackmail is the concrete that holds the entire organization together.
Which provides the perfect transition to the final layer of the author's thesis. Because the texts emphasize that while this ritualistic horror is the dark heart of the cabal, their ultimate goal isn't just to hide in basements and conduct rituals.
The spiritual engine powers a purely worldly objective: the complete orchestration of global geopolitics and total planetary domination. Welcome to the global octopus.
The authors argue that the institutions we are taught to view as mortal enemies, the Vatican, the CIA, the KGB, and even international mafia syndicates, are actually not distinct rival entities at all.
They're merely different tentacles attached to the same beast, controlled by the Black Pope, the Knights of Malta, and the occult elite to manipulate world events from behind the curtain.
And to prove this, the texts trace the historical timeline of the 20th century, starting immediately after World War II with the rat lines.
Now, the existence of the rat lines is a documented historical fact. They were the escape routes used by Nazis fleeing Europe after the collapse of the Third Reich.
But the authors of our sources frame the mechanism of these routes very specifically. They argue the Vatican didn't just accidentally harbor a few fleeing soldiers. They claim it was a systemic, fully funded intelligence operation to save top Nazi war criminals.
The texts specifically highlight the smuggling of Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon. They detail the exact logistics.
The Vatican allegedly utilized its network of remote monasteries as an impenetrable chain of safe houses. Vatican clerics utilized their influence to secure Red Cross passports under false names.
And ultimately, they used the sovereign diplomatic immunity of the Knights of Malta to smuggle these war criminals to South America, or purposefully integrate them into the ranks of Western intelligence agencies like the newly formed CIA.
Why would the Vatican save Nazis? Because, the authors argue, the Nazis were fundamentally anti-communist.
They were highly trained, ruthless assets that the cabal needed for the next phase of their geopolitical game, the Cold War. The texts assert an incredibly cynical view of history, arguing that the Jesuits deliberately manufacture ideologies and pit superpowers against each other to exhaust them.
The scope of the manipulation alleged here is staggering. The documents claim that the Jesuits actually sparked the Bolshevik Revolution.
Which initially sounds absurd. How does a Catholic intelligence order start communism?
But the authors explain the mechanism. They claim the Jesuits had spent centuries running deeply controlled communal societies in their South American reductions, basically massive plantation missions where wealth was centrally managed and individualism was erased.
The texts allege that the Jesuits fed this operational blueprint, their specific experiences of running a controlled commune, to Karl Marx in the British Museum, shaping the foundation of communist ideology.
They engineered the ideology of the East. And then, decades later, the authors claim they engineered the religious fervor of the West to attack it.
The texts point back to the Lady of Fatima visions. In 1917, 3 children in Portugal claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to them, demanding the consecration of Russia to prevent the spread of its errors.
The authors argue this was not a divine miracle, but a highly sophisticated, deliberate psychological operation by the cabal.
They weaponized the Fatima visions as anti-Russian propaganda to whip the Catholic populations of Europe into a frenzy, ultimately using it to spiritually justify and fuel Adolf Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, the brutal invasion of the Soviet Union.
So the cabal creates the communist enemy on one side of the board, and then they create the Holy Crusade against the enemy on the other side.
And the texts claim they used this exact same dialectic to engineer the entire Cold War, expanding what the authors call a communist inquisition.
The use of the CIA and the KGB as unaware pawns, fighting proxy wars across the globe to keep the world in a state of perpetual terror.
But orchestrating global proxy wars requires an infinite supply of untraceable money. And that brings us to the financial mechanics detailed in the texts. The Vatican Bank's deep integration with the international mafia and the P2 Masonic Lodge.
The authors center this argument on a man named Roberto Calvi.
Calvi was the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, and he was publicly known as God's banker due to his incredible close, intertwined financial dealings with the Vatican Bank, which was run by an American, Cardinal Paul Marcinkus.
In 1982, Banco Ambrosiano dramatically collapsed, and an estimated $3.5 billion simply vanished.
And how was Roberto Calvi found shortly after the collapse?
He was found hanging from scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. His pockets were stuffed with heavy bricks and thousands of dollars in varying currencies.
The authors point out the heavy Masonic symbolism of the murder. The P2 Lodge members referred to themselves as Blackfriars.
Hanging a man from Blackfriars Bridge with bricks in his pockets, bricks being the fundamental tool of a Mason, is not a subtle suicide. It is a blaring neon sign to anyone in the underworld.
The texts use the Calvi assassination, the missing billions, and Cardinal Marcinkus' refusal to leave Vatican City to avoid Italian police questioning as absolute proof of the mechanism.
The authors claim the Vatican Bank functions as the ultimate, untouchable, offshore money laundering facility for the global octopus.
because it operates behind the sovereign walls of the Holy Sultan. See, it is immune to audits from secular governments.
The texts allege the cabal uses this financial black hole to wash the profits of the international drug trade, which they claim is run jointly by the CIA and the mafia, and funnels that dark money back into funding their geopolitical black operations and their underground occult networks.
It is a closed-loop system of total corruption. But this raises one final crucial question. If the Vatican is secretly manipulating the United States and simultaneously manipulating Russia, if they're playing the CIA against the KGB and laundering mafia money to fund proxy wars, who actually wins in this devil's simulation?
If everyone is bleeding, who holds the prize?
Synthesizing the entire architectural blueprint presented by these authors, the ultimate winner is the cabal itself, culminating in the despotic figure of the Roman priest-king.
The chaos is not a byproduct of their operations. The chaos is the operation.
The constant state of global conflict, the endless threat of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War, the rampant terrorism, the devastating societal impact of the international drug trade, all of it is a calculated mechanism designed to exhaust the nations of the world.
They're slowly grinding down the psychology of the human race.
Precisely. They are breaking down the economic independence, the moral fortitude, and the psychological resilience of the global population.
The authors argue that eventually a traumatized, exhausted world will gladly surrender their sovereignty and their freedoms in exchange for the promise of peace and security.
They are making humanity compliant, ready to accept a centralized, totalitarian New World Order, a blessed despotism where the cabal rules absolutely, without the need for hidden catacombs.
Wow. Okay. Let's take a massive step back and look at the blueprint we have just traced. We have navigated a sprawling, highly controversial, and deeply disturbing alternate view of human history today.
We have covered centuries of alleged darkness.
We started by looking at sources that strip away the Christian facade of the Vatican, viewing it instead as an ancient Babylonian intelligence superpower, utilizing the absolute psychological discipline of the Jesuits and the sovereign borderless immunity of the Knights of Malta to manipulate global events.
We explored the terrifying historical mechanics of child separation, from the weaponized baptism laws in the Mortara case to the PR spin surrounding Holocaust orphans, to the logistical slave trade of the home children.
We examined the modern allegations of a systemic cover-up, where concordats act as legal force fields and the police forces designed to protect us are secretly infiltrated.
We waded through the most harrowing whistleblower testimonies imaginable, exploring the dark theology of Lucifer's Lodge, the obsidian tables of Savali's account, and the pragmatic use of ritualistic blackmail to secure unbreakable loyalty.
And finally, we unpacked a geopolitical theory where the rat lines, the Cold War, and the assassination of God's banker were all moves on a chessboard designed to exhaust humanity into accepting total subjugation.
It is an overwhelming amount of information. And as we always say, we have merely presented the architectural blueprint drawn by the authors of these provided texts. We've laid the mechanics of their arguments bare for you to examine, to scrutinize, and to research further on your own.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Regardless of whether you view these texts as the ravings of a massive paranoid fiction, or whether you fear they represent a suppressed, terrifying history of the world, they force us to confront a profound question about the very nature of human dominance.
Think back to that architectural blueprint we discussed at the very beginning. When we look at the foundation of this hypothetical cabal, why is it that across different empires, different centuries, and different ideological frameworks, the ultimate symbol of a society's corruption and the foundational building block for absolute, unchecked power always seems to require the exploitation and destruction of its most innocent and vulnerable members?
Why is the theft of a child the ultimate currency of the dark? What does that say about the true underlying nature of power itself? Something to keep you awake tonight. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.